Tori Whiting, trade economist at the Heritage Foundation. We've also got Neil Hare, who's a president at Global Visions Communications and a former vice president at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Clark Packard, trade policy manager for the R Street Institute and a former policy advisor for Nikki Haley, who's now the UN ambassador. And Scott Paul, who's the president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. Now, we have lots of trade expertise on this panel, and exactly 30 minutes before the Heritage Foundation chases us out. So I just want to quickly say, let me start with you. What do you think is the most important thing that Americans, that this audience should know about trade, considering the current status of the trade debate?
Well, thank you so much for your question. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for being here today. You know, the most important thing for me that, to my knowledge, hasn't been brought up at all this morning is the impact that the current trading environment is having on American manufacturers and individuals and people and businesses across this country. Part of what I do is I travel all around the country talking about why trade matters and why it's important. And recently I've had a lot of communication from manufacturers in the tool and die industry and steel and aluminum users who tell me, and I quote, "It feels like 2008 right now in the industry because prices are so volatile for them. They're not getting work. They're looking at having to lay off their workers," which is completely contrary to where this administration is and should be going with their trade policies.
These are the businesses that use steel and aluminum.
Yes, these are businesses that use steel and aluminum. They employ around 7 million Americans across this country, and they are really hurting. You know, tax reform is supposed to help these companies, deregulation is supposed to help these companies, but if they can't get the products that they need at good prices, at prices that are viable for them, they can't do business.
And I was thinking of slightly old data, and today I said about half of U.S. imports are inputs into other manufacturing. Is that still correct?
That's absolutely correct. So it's roughly, when you add in capital goods, which are things like machinery, you're looking at 2/3.
So what do you think is the most important thing people should know about trade right now?
Well, I think the biggest story is China, and it's not the biggest story just in trade, but I think of Trump's administration. We've been focused on Russia for a lot of reasons, but really it's going to be about China and what the recent trade negotiations have been. I mean, we do want to shout out to the Taiwan civil government and talk about Taiwan as a perfect example. You know, they're our 11th biggest economy in the world, our 9th biggest trading partner, and 7th biggest agricultural trading partner, and yet China has been exerting so much influence over our relationship with Taiwan. Recently doing military exercises in the Straits of Taiwan to flex their muscle over a country that's a big partner of the U.S. and that we want to be an even stronger partner. That's a big problem, and I think until we start dealing with that, we're going to be shortchanged. I think it was, I think President Trump is beholden to the Chinese, excuse me, because of the North Korean negotiations right now, and that may be a reason why we backed off the trade talks and the tariffs that we were talking about. But until we fix that problem, it's going to be a big issue for us.
Clark?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the largest problem facing the trade environment right now is just backing away from the global trade consensus. If you look at the lead up to the Great Depression and then World War II, sort of in the aftermath of that, the United States put in place sort of the rules-based trading system, the creation of the GATT, which turned into the WTO. And economists are basically unanimous in support of free trade. And so my concern is, for the first time, probably since Herbert Hoover, we've had a president who really just disregards or ignores that global consensus in favor of free markets and the exchange of goods across borders. So that, to me, is the largest concern. Scott?
Well, I think if anything's clear is that the rules of trade matter. That it's not just a market-based enterprise. And we see that in a couple of ways. Senator Manchin mentioned the failure of NAFTA, and it's right. It didn't build up a middle class in Mexico because the worker rights requirements were weak. So the theory didn't work. With respect to China, the idea was that it would democratize China. The opposite has happened. And China's entrenched in state-led capitalism because that wasn't a condition of their entry into the global trading system. Senator Sass mentioned lots of agricultural exports to Nebraska, but they're raw grains. They're not processed because China excludes those from its markets. And so these rules matter a great deal, and they can benefit American workers or businesses, or they can disadvantage us. I don't disagree that the global system set up after World War II was fantastic, but we didn't have any competition. They were asymmetrical. It was a Cold War play. We're in a different environment right now. We have a strategic competitor in China who doesn't believe in reciprocity. And we've seen a hollowing out of a lot of our strategic industrial capabilities, even as we're moving ahead to artificial intelligence, robotics. It's important that we get these rules right, or we're going to lose the race to the future as well.
Clark, I want to hear your reaction to Scott's assessment of China and Mexico in the last few decades.
Sure. I mean, look, I completely disagree with that. I think China's entry into the WTO caused certain problems. There's no one that would doubt that. You mentioned earlier the China shock. I think that's real. But I think if you talk to David Autor, he will tell you, look, this wasn't driven, I mean, it may have been driven by trade, but the policy response is about education. It's about flexibility in labor markets. It's about speeding up recovery. He is still a committed free trader. Now, I will say that I do agree the United States needs to be aggressive at times in enforcing trade rules. I testified before the United States Trade Representative last week, and I told them, take all of your complaints and file the case at the WTO. Now, maybe I'm just a trade lawyer and not an economist, but there seems to be this idea that the WTO is an ineffective organization. I think that's completely wrong. The United States wins 90% of the cases it brings. It wins a higher percentage of the cases brought against it. We were the architect of these rules. We have an obligation to protect the institution of the WTO.
Well, look, I'm as big a free trader as there possibly is, but I mean, China has been breaking the rules for years. I mean, they've been dumping steel into our country for years and years. They've been stealing our intellectual property blatantly for years and years, and we've just done nothing about it. So are we going to just keep that status quo, or are we going to push back a little bit?
File the case. File the case.
Well, we'll file the cases, but we haven't.
It's like playing whack-a-mole, though, with China.
What's your response? Is China cheating? Is there anything we can do about it? Does the WTO work?
Listen, here's the thing. I agree with Clark. You have to bring the cases to the WTO. He's absolutely correct that we win the majority of cases we take to the WTO, and we don't utilize that system as well as we should. Now, is there room maybe for improvement in the way that the WTO works and perhaps in the things that the WTO covers? There are some lapses in areas that we're looking at in more modern trade and more modern trading like digital trade and services that the WTO doesn't necessarily write the rules for. So there's definitely room for that. But what we do know time and time again, and I will tell you from an economist's point of view, what we do know time and time again is that tariffs cause problems and tariffs harm more people than they help, if they do help at all. And going that WTO route is the way to go. It is going to minimize the impact that we're going to have on the domestic economy. And if you don't want to go the WTO route and it's more appropriate to use existing U.S. trade laws like anti-dumping and countervailing duties, I'm not saying I'm a proponent of those types of duties, but what I'm saying is that there are trade laws on the books that are more appropriately suited for things like dumping and subsidizing. Now, the trade laws that are not appropriate are things like Section 201, Section 232, and in some cases, Section 301.
What do these sections do?
So Section 201 is the safeguards, which we saw used to impose tariffs on washing machines and solar panels and modules. There's a funny case about that, but I will kind of move on. Section 232 is a way to restrict trade based on national security, which is what we're seeing the steel and aluminum tariffs imposed under. And we're already seeing the devastating effects, like I was mentioning before, with some of those tariffs.
I want to talk about that for a second, because the idea of American trade policy, and Clark did mention this, if you look back at the biggest trade legislation that was passed in the 60s, the Trade Expansion Act, we wanted to expand trade, we wanted to enforce the law. That's where Section 232 comes from, and we wanted to help workers adjust. We do a terrible job at the enforcement and the adjustment. We've done a pretty good job. with the expansion. And if you don't support enforcement, if you don't support an adjustment, support for expansion is going to erode. And that's what we've seen. That's what you see in President Trump. He has correctly identified some of the flaws. And there's a number of Republican and Democratic voters who clearly aligned themselves with that message, and that the Clinton, Bush, Obama approach on trade did not work, and the stakes couldn't be higher with the strategic competition with China. We cannot back off.
Well, let me ask you a quick question about the steel and aluminum tariffs. If you're representing manufacturers, don't a lot of them see that as just a massive price hike on their inputs?
There's two ways this works. No one is entitled to a dump price. I mean, that's why you have the rules of trade. There's not an entity that's entitled to a dump price, and we're trying to root out overcapacity in the Chinese steel sector, trying to make sure that its bad behavior doesn't spill over the borders, and you see the transshipments.
So is rooting out overcapacity increasing prices by 40% domestically?
So prices go up and down. The biggest shock that manufacturers saw in China in prices were when China started its massive consumption in the mid-2000s. So I don't want Beijing to call the shots on our steel pricing. I want it to be set, and you have to realign it. Otherwise, you face China, which has 5 out of the 10 largest steel companies, they're state-owned, essentially distorting the world market. That's something that private sector producers in the United States and Europe can't afford. I mean, was it inelegantly rolled out? I don't disagree with that. It could have been better rolled out, but we have to engage in this process.
Well, Clark, I want to ask you about the state-owned enterprises in China. Now, first of all, this was one thing when I talked to the Obama people about TPP. One of their goals was to go after state-owned enterprises in other countries, and I thought that was salutary. But when we look at, I mean, the largest bank in the world is a state-owned Chinese bank, and in addition, there's all these state-owned industries and all this state support. So they are clearly, what Senator Manchin says, that's not fair, and so it's not free. That these guys are so subsidized that the talk of free trade is ill-fitting for a market that is so subsidized that, in fact, so much of it is, in fact, government agencies we're competing against rather than companies. What's your response?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with the benefit. One of the great benefits of the TPP was the Obama administration took that issue seriously, and I commend them. I fought hard as anybody in this town to get the TPP done. I really desperately wanted that agreement done. I do agree that it's a problem. I don't know that it's as big of a problem as people seem to make it out to be, because if you think about it, if a foreign, and Scott's going to disagree with me here, but if a foreign country wants to subsidize a product to the benefit of American consumers, that's fine with me. From a pure economic perspective, that is totally fine with me. If they're so dumb that they're going to spend their scarce resources making it cheaper for me to buy something, I'm sorry, I think that's not the end of the world.
And I think that Clark, you're right with the economic theory behind it, and I think I sympathize with you, Scott, because I don't disagree that enforcing when enforcement is necessary is a good thing to do. What I do disagree with is enforcing our trade laws without considering downstream impacts, which is what our current laws do. No law in the books requires a full cost-benefit analysis that looks at the impact on downstream industries, and that's why we always see these devastating effects.
Well, you can't pretend like trade policy exists in a vacuum. I mean, it goes hand in hand with foreign policy and diplomacy. I mean, I think what you just saw happen was, China was brokering our deal with Kim Jong-un in North Korea to sit down and talk about nuclear policy or foreign policy, and trade policy got caught up in the middle of it. And all of a sudden, the tariffs we were talking about, whether you believe in them or not, are now off the table. And now, whether you believe in it or not, the talks are off the table too, potentially, as of what we heard yesterday. So this isn't just about downstream to the consumer in America. This is American foreign policy at stake. And we can't be pushed around by China. We just can't let it happen anymore.
That's why we needed TPP.
I agree with that. We should have backed out of that one.
For Clark and Tori, let's start with you, Tori. The national security is one point. We talked earlier in the David Autor studies talk about how communities can be totally demolished, and you demolish the rural county south of Pittsburgh, and you put it on a spreadsheet and you say their losses are smaller than the gains to the whole economy, that's sort of an inhuman and I would say an unconservative way of looking at it, just thinking, well, you can account their job losses. It's not just job losses, it's criminality, it's illegitimate births. So is there a conservative argument that while more free and open trade maximizes the national wealth, there are other goods that need to be pursued and that might cut against the arguments for free trade?
Well, I know you had a great conversation with Senator Sass at the beginning of the program this morning, and I mean, I absolutely do sympathize with those things, and I think I'll answer this by kind of telling you a story. Last year I had the opportunity to go visit a steel mill, actually a shuttered steel mill north of Pittsburgh in Sherrill, Pennsylvania. Sharon, pardon me. But and this mill had been completely shuttered for years, and it was reopened by what we call a steel slab converter. So it's somebody who comes in a different part of the manufacturing process for steel making. And these people reopened this shuttered steel mill and are benefiting from the fact that they can import slab to then further process. And that's possible because of trade. So I know that there are negative consequences and negative externalities in other areas, but the net is there, and the net is in the data. And stories like that are what make me optimistic about free trade really being the proper answer.
Clark?
I tend to agree with that in some respects, that there is something about community. I just don't know that trade has a ton to do with it anymore. And I am sympathetic that people were slow to respond. Economists got it wrong. That look, you admit China into the WTO, there's going to be a surge of imports, but people are quick to adjust. In the Otter study, I take that seriously. That it was not as fast as economists thought. But for every story you hear about a shuttered steel mill, if you think about, I'm from South Carolina. If you think about going to Greenville, South Carolina, you have major plants opening, and that's from foreign investment. And so and guess what? Those are building communities there. So I think it's tough, and I just don't know what sort of guide you use to determine, other than sort of a market process, that the job in Pennsylvania is more valuable than the job in South Carolina. It just so happens that South Carolina has been a net beneficiary of things like NAFTA and the WTO. And we need to do better. We need to do more. But we have a tendency in this country to sort of crucify trade for the sins of bad domestic policy, and that's my argument, that this is not really about trade. It's about how we respond to technology, the sort of automation. And Ben Sass hit that right on the head. I just don't see how trade kind of fits in long term with that.
Scott, do you have a reaction either to I guess I would wonder about the automation, because when we have Senator Manchin up here and he's talking about jobs, manufacturing jobs. Now, manufacturing as a share of the economy has stayed pretty high while the jobs have fallen through the floor. So should the working man have any confidence that the pro-manufacturing policies that you want are going to be pro-jobs?
Yeah, look, there's evidence that they can be, and the issue with automation is that manufacturing jobs held pretty steady and just aligned themselves with business cycles during the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and most of the 90s. Where they started to drop off was when China entered the World Trade System, and we lost a third of all manufacturing jobs. And there's not only a correlation, there's a causation there. They've picked back up a little bit, and it shows me that we can be successful. And part of that is recovery from the recession. And yeah, what I have to ask, Tim, is that in this economy, do we have a shortage of $5 imported T-shirts, or do we have a shortage of high quality jobs, and do we have a shortage of getting skilled workers into the labor force? There's strong evidence built on the Otter work that a lot of these communities that saw deindustrialization, there's a high percentage of folks sitting out of the labor market because they're addicted to opioids, or they're on disability, or other issues like that. And trade was a factor in that. We can manage automation. We always have, and we've always found jobs that way, even in manufacturing. But I go back to my first statement. You have to get the rules right. If we don't have reciprocity, if we don't demand reciprocity, if we don't say to China, we're against a state-led effort for you to dominate artificial intelligence, robotics, advanced vehicles, aerospace. I mean, you think about the number of jobs they support in the United States or could support, and it should scare people.
Now, why should that scare people? I'm a free market guy, and I think if you told me that Donald Trump or, 4 or 8 years from now, President Kamala Harris was going to launch a state-run 10-year plan to make sure that the government is going to make sure that we dominate artificial intelligence, I would go and short the whole idea of artificial intelligence if I could. I think that government central planning tends to be an ineffective thing, and that if China wants to do it, we should argue against it because it's bad, but that it'll be, why should I be scared of China's ability to do that? Don't I have to have some faith in the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government in order to be worried about that?
I don't want you to have faith in the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist
but
Party.
why are you afraid
But
of
what
that?
I'm saying is the scale matters with respect to China, and that's why we have to pay attention to it. We also have to pay attention to it because at a minimum, China is a strategic competitor. I don't see that changing, and no amount of wishful thinking will change that. And so do you want China effectively writing the rules of artificial intelligence, robotics? Do you want them dominating aerospace platforms in a way? That worries me from a security perspective. It worries me from a potential jobs perspective. The answer is not to have the government step in and have a $10 billion plan to do this, but we can have smart public-private partnerships through the tax code, through other mechanisms. We can, through workforce, we can find ways to engage with this. But all of those efforts are undercut if there's not a level playing field.
And because you said rules of robotics, we're now going to shift to the Isaac Asimov section of this. Clark, do you worry about China for these national security purposes, even aside from trade issues? Might it be bad if they're dominating aerospace and AI rules?
So there are a couple things here. I think that it's interesting. I see all these people, maybe like Laura Ingraham, she's on TV, who's just this avowed capitalist, but has so much faith in the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, there's something sort of weird about that, right? That like if you actually believe what you're saying you believe, which is freedom and free markets will win out in the long run, have faith in the American system as opposed to their system. Now, I do have concerns about the sort of national security issue. What I will say, though, is the Trump administration seems to be taking their eye off the ball right now. And what I mean by that is the Chinese government wants to focus all of our attention on things like auto and I guess, grains and agriculture products. But the real fight is over sort of IP because that's as part of their long-term strategy. And again, I think that the WTO is the proper place to litigate that, and we should be really aggressive about that, but do it within the confines of the WTO, the structure that we put in place.
Neil, specifically, how would you address China?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I think we need to increase U.S. exports. Only 1% of our 30 million businesses are exporters, and the majority are exporting just to Canada and Mexico. So I think we need to work to increase that. That's a very important point. But I think with China, I think we have to take a hard line. I mean, it goes against some of my free trade principles and free market principles, but quite frankly, I don't think the WTO is the place to do that. I think we have to really take an aggressive stand with them on the foreign policy side. I think Trump was going down the right road. I think
With the tariffs?
Yeah, by saying and being aggressive and saying, we aren't going to take it anymore. And that's Donald Trump's mantra, isn't it? It's America first. We aren't going to take it anymore. We're tired of you dumping steel. We're tired of you stealing our intellectual property. We're tired of you trying to scare us with our good ally in Taiwan with your military bluster and flying over and doing military exercises. We're not going to, we're the United States of America. We're the strongest economy in the world by far. We generate most of the IP in the world today. We have the strongest military by far. Why are we letting China dictate to us what we should be doing foreign policy-wise, trade-wise, economically-wise?
Well, so then, yeah, Tori, what about that argument for sort of a trade war is driving a tough bargain? If we want China to build down its state-owned enterprises, to stop doing these 5-year plans that are sort of strategically aggressive, why not say, okay, we're going to put some tariffs on the stuff that you're importing, and then we'll take them down if you play ball and free up your markets.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. Tariffs don't work. Spoiler alert. That's the news of the day. There's your headline. Tariffs don't work. Now, Clark has a great point, like I've said before, going to the WTO. Another recommendation the Heritage Foundation has for dealing with legitimate intellectual property theft with China is to sanction individuals and companies who either steal IP from the United States or are known to be using known stolen intellectual property. That can be done by businesses and maybe even chambers working with the Department of Commerce, and then that information being given to the Department of Treasury and those entities being sanctioned. There are practical ways to actually go at the problem with a scalpel instead of with a nuclear missile.
So say more about what you mean when you say tariffs don't work, because I thought the free trade argument was that tariffs have this big negative impact on the economy by driving up the prices on imported goods. If they're driving up the prices on imported goods, that seems that it's working and it's making more room for domestic manufacturers.
It's not the case. So if you think about it in this case, if you are increasing the price of, say, steel and aluminum for the 7 million Americans who are employed in those industries, who are the steelworkers going to have to sell to? If you are affecting all of the jobs in the using industries. So increasing the prices, and the point of a tariff is to increase prices. Increasing the prices is not going to stimulate more growth in jobs and manufacturing in the United States. It's actually going to hinder it. It's going to cripple it from actually being competitive in the world market when U.S. prices are higher than world prices.
Look, I wish I were Wilbur Ross sitting here with the soup can and the tall boy, because he made the right point, which is the economic impact of the tariffs to the overall U.S. economy is nominal. The specific impact that it can have.
Do you want to tell that to the manufacturers in Michigan and Ohio and Indiana?
Fabricated metals, the employment has continued to go up. The forward-looking indicators are good. There will be horror stories, no doubt they will be. But
millions?
They should have seen this coming since June of 2016 when Donald Trump said, I'm going to do Section 232, and said, how can I align my supply chain to plan for this eventuality? That's kind of, to me, that's a business
like us in
responsibility.
2016 were saying that Donald Trump wasn't going to be president. So, Clark.
Yeah, just real quick. Look, like if you can isolate the tariffs on just steel and aluminum, I take that at face value that it's a small portion to the overall economy. The problem with these things is they start to spiral out of control, right? And you get this tit for tat back and forth. And we saw that trade tensions started to ratchet up. And so that's where you can get, bring in a lot of unrelated industries, and this thing can start to expand. And so I think that that's a little disingenuous to say, well, it's just a tiny part. It has the potential to really ratchet out of control.
And we're already seeing that.
Well, I think we are talking about a scalpel. You said use a scalpel, right? We're not saying tariffs on the entire world or on.
Well, Section 232 is tariffs on the entire world.
But I'm saying let's focus on the one particular problem here, the one country that's causing the problem, not every country out there. And I agree that we should go back into TPB. We should really revisit that and get
All right, we have about 2 minutes left, so I just want sort of a quick comment, whether it's forward-looking, what you think the Trump administration should do, or the most important thing that was left out. So let's start down with you, Scott.
Well, I can't ask the president to be consistent with the tweet, so I'm going to not. That would be helpful to certainty. But Clark mentioned South Carolina and FDI. There's a reason why car companies started producing in the United States. It's because we have a 25% tariff on imported trucks, and it's because Reagan threatened the Japanese and said, if you don't start making more here, we're going to shut you out of our market. And so an aggressive trade posture can work. It has to be smart. It can't be permanent, but it has to be part of the arsenal you're willing to use if you want to be competitive in this marketplace, particularly with the massive amount of state-led capitalism in China.
Thank you. Clark.
I think that we need to really get serious about NAFTA, and sort of the United States needs to back down from some of its unreasonable demands. NAFTA has been a great success. I disagree with some of the things that have been said, but overall NAFTA has been pretty good. And at this point, it's the United States taking a really ridiculous posture on things like sunset, a $16 minimum wage in the automotive industry. So I think NAFTA is a big deal for our economy, and I think we need to get it right.
First of all, I think the Trump administration should foster closer ties with Taiwan to show China that they can't push us around and we can establish a closer relationship with whoever we like. But second of all, I think, again, the administration needs to decide whether they're just going to do bilateral trade agreements or they are going to do multilateral agreements too, because I think they're going back and forth. Should we go back into TPP or not? Should we just focus on China? What are we doing with NAFTA? I would try to get that message right, and I would focus on that.
Yeah, well, thanks for giving me the last word. For me, I'm a native Michigander, right? My dad works in the auto industry, so I come at this from a really personal perspective of understanding what people are really going through. And for me, it is about who is picking the winners and losers in the economy. Is it the government picking the winners and losers? I know some folks may say that it's China picking the winners and losers in the United States, but is the US government picking who's winning and who's losing, or is the market and our business owners who work hard picking who's winning and who's losing? And things like tariffs and other sorts of mechanisms that are hindering the ability of American businesses to just do their job, that's not going to get us moving forward. So trade policy needs to be focused on what makes it best, what makes it easier for Americans to buy and sell around the world.
Now, it seems like we did not solve the trade debate, but I think we had a very good discussion here. So everybody, please thank our panelists.